He hired a nurse to care for his sick father, treated her like the help from day one, and made it crystal clear she was to pack her bags the second her contract was up. But when the 30 days finally came to an end, he was the one who discovered he could no longer breathe right without her around. This is a fictional story created for entertainment, about a man who learned the hard way that the heart doesn't respect expiration dates or signed contracts. If you've ever believed that certain people don't belong in certain rooms, stay until the end of this story, because it's going to make you rethink every judgment you've ever made in your life. And if you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, hit that button right now. Every week there's a new story waiting for you. The town of Kerrville, nestled in the Texas Hill Country, had a habit of keeping its secrets tucked away in the limestone hills and in the silence that settled over the pastures after the October thunderstorms. In 1987, anyone driving down the dirt road leading to the Sterling Ridge Ranch knew immediately, just by looking at the wrought iron gates and the freshly painted white barns, that old money lived there. Fat cattle grazing in the fields, ancient live oak trees lining the drive, a two-story limestone manor with a wraparound porch. Everything screamed that the owner of this place didn't need a damn thing from anybody. Richard Sterling was 42 years old, had 2 grown kids living in Austin, and a 78-year-old father who had suffered a major stroke 3 weeks prior. He also carried a 4-year widowhood, not as a tragedy, but as a suit of armor. Ever since his wife Catherine died in a car crash on a Sunday afternoon, Richard had built a shell of efficiency and coldness around himself that intimidated even the oldest, toughest ranch hands on the payroll. He didn't cry, he didn't complain, and he didn't let anyone close enough to see if there was anything still beating beneath all that rigidity. When Dr. Miller, the town physician, knocked on the manor's heavy oak door to explain that old man Arthur Sterling needed round-the-clock care during his recovery, physical therapy, blood pressure monitoring, medication management, and company during his restless nights, Richard listened with his arms crossed. Then he got straight to the point. He needed a professional, someone competent, discreet, and who understood she was being hired for a job, not to become part of the family. 30 days. After that, the old man ought to be well enough for a regular housekeeper to take over. Dr. Miller nodded, wrote down the instructions, and before leaving mentioned a young woman who worked at the county health clinic in a neighboring, poorer town. He said she was damn good, meticulous, and that the patients adored her. Richard gave a curt nod and asked no further questions. To him, a resume was proven by results, not praises. Mary Ann Hayes arrived at the Sterling Ridge Ranch early on a Monday morning, carrying a battered leather duffel bag, a medical kit, and a pair of white sneakers that were long past their retirement age. She was 34, with dark hair tied in a simple bun, sun-kissed skin, and that calm demeanor of someone who has seen enough people suffer to not be easily spooked by anything. She had taken a Greyhound bus into Kerrville and hitched a ride in a local's pickup truck heading toward the ranch, simply because she didn't own a car and saw absolutely no shame in it. Martha, the housekeeper and cook who had been on the ranch for over 20 years, was the first to open the gate. She looked the young woman up and down, saw the small bag, the scuffed sneakers, the white uniform slightly yellowed from endless washing, and felt a mix of sympathy and worry. Sympathy because she recognized in Mary Ann's face the mark of someone who truly knows hard work. Worry because she knew her boss all too well. Richard received Mary Ann on the porch. He didn't offer his hand, nor did he offer her a glass of sweet tea. He laid down the rules before even showing her the room where she'd sleep. Meals taken separately from the family, use the back door, provide a daily status report on his father, no visitors allowed on the property, and absolutely no using the house phone for personal calls. His voice was firm. His eyes never dropped from hers. Mary Ann listened to every word, nodded, and simply said, "Excuse me, sir. May I go see Mr. Arthur now?" Richard stood there for a second, caught off guard. He expected her to ask more questions, maybe complain about a condition or try to negotiate. But she just wanted to get to work. He gestured down the hallway, and off she went, just like that. What he didn't know, and what would take him weeks to realize, was that this woman with the scuffed sneakers and the small bag was exactly the kind of person life had taught him to ignore. Arthur Sterling was a man who had tamed hundreds of acres of Texas soil with his bare hands, and now he lay in a heavy mahogany bed, with half his face slightly drooping, his speech slurred, like a man trying to shove thick words through a narrow door. When Mary Ann walked into the bedroom, his eyes were open, staring at the ceiling. There was a mix of rage and humiliation in his gaze that she recognized instantly, the fury of a man who had been strong his entire life and suddenly found himself depending on strangers just to take a bath. She didn't pretend it was easy. She didn't use that sugary, condescending baby voice some professionals adopt with the elderly. She pulled up a chair, sat down right at his eye level, and said calmly, "Mr. Arthur, my name is Mary Ann. I'm going to be staying with you for a while. You don't have to like me, and I don't have to like you, but you need to trust that I'm going to do my job right." The old man stared at her for a long moment. Then, with great effort, he moved his good hand toward her. It wasn't a greeting. It was a test. He wanted to see if she would flinch. Mary Ann took his hand firmly without any excessive delicacy and said, "Still got a grip like a vice, huh?" It was the first time in 3 weeks that Arthur Sterling tried to smile. In the weeks that followed, Mary Ann established a routine that no one had been able to force on the stubborn old man since the stroke. An early bath, light physical therapy she'd learned at the rural clinic, meals on a strict schedule, and medication without delay. She learned to read Mr. Arthur's moods, when he was in pain but too proud to admit it, when he was lonely but didn't know how to say it, when he wanted company but wouldn't ask. In those moments, she simply stayed. She'd pull out the little book of crossword puzzles she kept in her bag and just sat there, present without being invasive, close without being suffocating. Richard, who walked past the hallway 2 or 3 times a day to check on his father, started noticing something strange. The old man was doing better than expected. Not just physically, his blood pressure had stabilized, the movement on his affected side was slowly returning, but there was something about Arthur's demeanor when Mary Ann was in the room, less rigid, less alone. Richard watched through the crack in the door and didn't quite know what to do with what he was feeling. There was a group of women in Kerrville that Richard Sterling associated with out of pure social obligation. They were wealthy widows, daughters of oilmen or ranchers, clearly interested in him, in the practical sense of the word, the type of women who calculate acreage before they calculate feelings. They'd show up at the ranch with various excuses, bringing a pie left over from the church bake sale, asking about Mr. Arthur's health, or offering help that had never been requested. One Wednesday afternoon, while Mary Ann was hanging Mr. Arthur's bedsheets on the clothesline out back, because she had discovered he slept better when his sheets smelled of sunshine and plain lye soap, just like the ones his mother used when he was a boy, Eleanor Vance pulled up in her Cadillac. She was a neighboring landowner and the mother of a 26-year-old girl who had been practically pushed into Richard's arms on at least 3 occasions. Eleanor stepped out of her car, saw Mary Ann at the clothesline and stopped. She gave the nurse that inventory-taking look that certain high society women perfect over decades, the look that classifies, catalogues, and dismisses a person in 3 seconds flat. Then she walked up the porch steps without so much as a good afternoon. In the kitchen, she commented to Martha, the cook, loud enough to be heard through the open window, "What a common girl they hired to look after the old man. I heard she took the Greyhound bus to get here, doesn't even own a car, and she's living right here under this roof. I say Richard ought to be more careful about who he lets into his home." Martha didn't reply. She was too old to waste her breath on gossip that led nowhere. Out at the clothesline, Mary Ann heard every single word. Her hands didn't stop. She folded the sheet with the exact same care as before and pinned it to the line. But her jaw tightened for just a second, like someone swallowing a bitter pill and deciding not to let the taste ruin her day. Richard, who had stepped out of his study to pour a cup of coffee and passed by the side window, heard it too. And he did what he always did with things that made him uncomfortable. He ignored it. He went back to his study, shut the door, and stared at the ranch's ledger books without being able to focus on a single number. That night, at dinner time, Mary Ann was eating in the breakfast nook, separated from the dining room, per the rules. Richard told Martha to take a large slice of pecan pie to the nurse. Martha did, and she returned with a very discreet smirk on her face, saying nothing. She was old enough to know that proud men always find convoluted ways to do simple, kind things, Mr. Arthur had a terrible night during the 3rd week of October. His blood pressure spiked, he grew highly agitated, tried to get out of bed, and nearly fell. Mary Ann heard him through the baby monitor she had set up in her room, a little device she had borrowed from the clinic and brought on her own dime, and she was there in under 2 minutes, still in her pajamas, her dark hair falling loose over her shoulders. She stayed by his side from 2 in the morning until almost 5. She spoke very little. She just held his hand while his pressure slowly dropped, while the tremors subsided, while the old man slowly came back to himself. At 3:30 in the morning, Arthur Sterling, a man who had barked orders at roughnecks his whole life and never asked anyone for a damn thing, looked at her with tear-filled eyes and slurred, "I'm terrified of dying alone." Mary Ann didn't tell him it wasn't going to happen. She didn't lie. She just said, "You're not alone tonight, Mr. Arthur." It was enough. Richard found out what happened the next morning when Martha told him the nurse had stayed awake the entire night with his father. He walked into his father's room, looked at the man who seemed truly rested for the first time in weeks, and then walked to the breakfast nook where Mary Ann was drinking black coffee, her eyes shadowed from lack of sleep. He stood in the doorway for a moment. She looked up at him with that trademark tranquility of hers, a serenity that wasn't indifference but the peace of someone who knows exactly why they do what they do. "Mr. Arthur needed me during the night," she said simply, like a professional giving a clinical update. Richard nodded. Then, surprising even himself, he said, "Thank you." It wasn't a phrase that came easily to him. Mary Ann noticed the massive effort behind it. She accepted it with a nod, making no big deal out of it, and went back to her coffee. Richard lingered there for a second longer than necessary before walking away, but something had shifted inside him slightly, like a boulder. A heavy rain starts to loosen from a cliffside before anyone notices. There were 15 days left on the contract when it rained for 3 days straight in Kerrville. That stubborn, gray Texas hill country rain that soaks into your bones. The ranch was covered in morning mist, the pastures turned a deep, dark green, and the smell of wet cedar and earth blew through every window. It was the kind of weather that makes people quiet down and think about the things they usually keep locked away. On one of those afternoons, Richard found Mary Ann sitting on the back porch in an old wooden rocking chair, looking out at the pastures, with a mug of chamomile tea in her hands. Mr. Arthur was asleep. She wasn't resting out of laziness. There was a clarity in the way she sat still that said she was using those minutes to recharge her batteries, not waste time. Richard wandered out there with a flimsy excuse, claiming he was checking the porch roof for leaks, and ended up standing next to her, not knowing how to leave. After an awkward moment of silence, Mary Ann said, without looking at him, "Mr. Arthur told me you were a different man when Catherine was alive." Richard went rigid. His late wife's name in the mouth of a stranger was exactly the kind of thing that usually made him instantly pull back and build a wall. But there was something in Mary Ann's tone. It wasn't morbid curiosity, it wasn't gossip. It was a careful observation, the kind you make when you genuinely want to understand someone, not judge them. "My father talks too much," he said, his voice harsher than he intended. "He talks. About everything. About the days when you and she used to go dancing at the Heritage Hall, about how you used to laugh so easily, about your kids when they were little." She paused. "He is incredibly proud of you. I just think he doesn't know how to say it." Richard stared out at the pasture. His jaw was clenched tight. He had learned to exist right next to his grief without ever looking directly at it, and this woman, suddenly, was shining a flashlight exactly into the corner he kept pitch black. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. Mary Ann looked him dead in the eye. "Because when my contract is up and I leave, you're the one who's going to be left with him. And he needs a son, Richard, not a ranch manager." Richard didn't answer, but he didn't walk away either. He stood there beside her, watching the fine rain fall over the Texas soil. For a length of time, neither of them could have accurately measured. And when he finally did walk away, there was a strange tightness in his chest. Not anger, not offense, but the feeling of something that had been named without his permission, and now that it had a name, could no longer be ignored. Kerrville was a decent-sized town, but the country has a gift for making any place feel like a tiny village when it comes to gossip. It didn't take long for word to spread that Richard Sterling was letting a lower-class nurse live at the ranch, eat from his kitchen, and sit chatting with him on the back porch in the afternoons. Every detail that left someone's mouth reached its destination doubled in size. Eleanor Vance ran into two friends at the beauty parlor on Main Street and told them, with that fake concern that is actually just thinly veiled malice, that the girl had been seen slipping out of old man Arthur's room in the dead of night. And who's to say it was just the old man's room she was slipping out of? Nobody asked for proof, because in a beauty parlor, proof is strictly optional. At the local pharmacy, a clerk who knew Richard's older son in Austin mentioned that the nurse had been seen driving the ranch's truck to the grocery store. This was true, because Richard had told Martha that Mary Ann could use the beat-up old Chevy C10 to pick up medical supplies for Arthur. But by the time the story left the pharmacy, the rusty Chevy had turned into one of Richard's luxury cars, and the medical supplies had morphed into God only knows what she's spending his money on. Caroline, a woman from a prominent family who had briefly dated Richard 2 years prior and still hadn't digested the rejection, announced to anyone listening after Sunday service, "Poor Richard. Widowhood leaves a man so vulnerable, doesn't it? And those lower-class girls just have a hustle about them. They know exactly how to exploit a situation." The funny thing was, not a single one of these people had ever spoken a word to Mary Ann. None of them had stepped foot in Arthur's room to see his condition. None of them had stayed awake, holding the hand of a terrified old man at 3 in the morning. They were building an entire image of a woman out of scraps of prejudice, and the image they built said much more about them than it ever did about Mary Ann. Out at the ranch, Mary Ann occasionally caught wind of these rumors through Martha, who had a habit of repeating gossip not to spread it, but to warn her. Mary Ann would listen, thank Martha, and not change a single thing about how she did her job. Growing up dirt poor in a family of 8 kids in the Texas Panhandle, she had learned early on that other people's judgment is just noise that only knocks down those who have no solid foundation to stand on. There were 2 days left on the contract when Richard walked into his study, stared at the calendar on the wall, and stood there for far too long. Then he walked to the window and looked out at the front courtyard, where Mary Ann was helping Mr. Arthur take his first steps with a walker, shaky, hesitant steps, but real steps. And there was an effort and a fiery determination in the old man's face that Richard hadn't seen since long before the stroke. He walked to the front door, opened it, and leaned against the frame. Mary Ann saw him, but didn't stop. She was entirely focused on making sure Mr. Arthur's foot landed in the right spot. The old man moved forward 2 yards, 3 yards, stopped, took a deep, ragged breath, and said, with his slurred but proud voice, "I'm going to do 10 today." Mary Ann smiled. "You're going to do 10 today, yes, sir." And he did 10. 10 slow, crooked, glorious yards from a man who had been bedridden for weeks. When Arthur reached the wrought-iron bench at the end of the courtyard and sat down, there were tears in the corners of his eyes that he pretended were sweat. Mary Ann pretended to believe him. Richard went back inside without saying a word, but he walked straight to the rotary phone and dialed Dr. Miller, not to ask about his father's condition, but to ask if there was any possibility of extending the nurse's contract. "Doctor." Miller paused on the other end of the line and said, "Richard, Arthur is well enough now to just have a housekeeper keep an eye on him. He doesn't need specialized nursing care anymore." Heavy silence on the line. "But if you want to hire her for another reason," the doctor added, with the diplomacy of a man who has known his patient for 30 years, "well, that's an entirely different conversation." Richard hung up the phone without saying goodbye. On the night of the 29th day, Richard walked into the breakfast nook after dinner, for the first time since Mary Ann had arrived. She was reading an old anatomy textbook, drinking her last cup of coffee for the day, her duffel bag already half-packed in the corner of the small room that had been hers for almost a month. He knocked on the wooden doorframe. She looked up. "Can I sit down?" he asked. It was the first time he had asked permission to enter a room in his own house. Mary Ann closed the book and gestured to the chair across from her. He sat, crossed his hands on the table, and stared at them for a moment. "Dr. Miller says my father doesn't need specialized care anymore," he began. "I agree," she said. "He's doing very well. It'll take time to get everything back, but the major risk has passed. So your contract ends tomorrow." Yes, sir. Pause. I wanted to know, he said, and his voice lost its customary iron grip for a split second, if you would have any interest in continuing, in a different capacity, as the person in charge of his long-term care, with much better conditions. A beat, with a much better salary. Mary Ann looked at him closely. Her eyes held that careful, clinical read she used for her patients, trying to decipher the real pain hiding beneath the words being spoken. You're talking about a job, she said. It wasn't a question. Yes, he replied, but the way he said it, a little too fast, a little too defensive, was the tone of a man trying to convince himself just as much as the person listening. Mary Ann sat quietly for a few seconds. Then she said, Richard. It was the first time she had used his first name. He looked up, startled. I have a job at the county clinic that I like. I have patients who depend on me there. I can't stay here just for a bigger paycheck. I'm not just talking about I know what you aren't talking about, she interrupted calmly, and I think you know it too. But until you figure out how to say exactly what it is you want, there's no point in us having this conversation. Richard stared at her. His jaw locked up again, that ancient ironclad defense mechanism. And then, for the first time in years, he let the tension go. He didn't say anything. He still didn't have the vocabulary for what was crowding his chest. But he didn't run away. He sat there, staring at his crossed hands on the table, while the wall clock ticked away the minutes with that indifferent patience that only clocks possess. Mary Ann picked her book back up and started to read, but she slid a clean mug across the table and poured him a cup of coffee. Mary Ann left the next morning with the same scuffed leather duffel bag she had arrived with. Martha wrapped up a large slice of homemade peach cobbler and some preserves for her to take. For the road, she said, as if a 2-hour bus ride required survival rations. Mr. Arthur, from the bench in the courtyard where he now sat every morning, waved at her with his good hand and yelled with his slurred voice, which she now understood perfectly. You're a good girl. She walked over and kissed the old man on the forehead. She hugged Martha. She waved at the ranch hands working nearby, and she started walking. Richard hadn't come out of the house to say goodbye, but she found him waiting down by the main property line, standing next to the massive iron gate, hands shoved deep into his denim pockets, staring at some undefined spot between her and the horizon. As she approached, he pulled one hand out and extended a manila envelope toward her. Your month's pay plus a bonus, he said, for the night you stayed up with my dad, and for the other nights I never knew about. She looked at the envelope, then at him. You don't have to do that, she said. I need to, he replied. She took the envelope. Not because she desperately needed the cash, though she knew the value of every hard-earned dollar, but because she understood that, to him, this was the only language he currently knew how to speak to say something he couldn't yet put into words. Take good care of your father, she told him. I will, he answered. And then, looking her dead in the eyes for the first time since he walked into the kitchen the night before, he said, Mary Ann. She waited. I learned something this month. She waited a little longer. That I've been taking care of the wrong things. She nodded slightly. A small smile touched her lips. Everybody learns that when the time is right. And she walked away down the dusty Texas road, her bag swinging from her shoulder, never looking back, while the morning sun cut the hill country landscape into wide golden ribbons. January turned to February, and February into March. Mr. Arthur kept improving slowly, fueled by the sheer stubbornness characteristic of men who built empires from dirt and refused to let a stroke have the final say. Richard started sitting next to his father on the courtyard bench in the afternoons, not to give him ranch reports, not to solve problems, but simply to sit. It was new for both of them, this keeping each other company without a productive purpose. The first few days they just sat in total silence. Then the old man started telling stories, and Richard finally started truly listening. At the Bandera County Health Clinic, Mary Ann returned to the routine she had paused for 30 days, bandaging wounds, checking blood sugar, treating kids with fevers, and old folks with aching joints. The work was grueling, and the county funding was never enough, but she loved it with that practical affection, of someone who doesn't need to romanticize her job because she already knows it's vital. She didn't speak of Richard to anyone. There was nothing to tell. A contract was signed, a job was done, and a half-finished conversation had happened in a kitchen. Those things were hers, tucked away in a quiet corner of her mind, where they didn't need to be poked and prodded by outsiders' eyes. But sometimes, at the end of an exhausting day, she would remember the look on Mr. Arthur's face as he walked those 10 yards in the courtyard. And she felt that specific, nameless satisfaction that only honest, heartfelt caregiving can produce. In April, Richard showed up at the clinic. He arrived in the ranch's heavy-duty Julie work truck, not his luxury SUV, using the excuse that he had brought donated medical supplies for the dispensary. And he actually had. Boxes full of antibiotics, bandages, and basic meds he had driven all the way to San Antonio to buy after calling the county office and finding out the clinic was severely understocked. Mary Ann found him in the tiny waiting room, surrounded by cardboard boxes and a highly confused receptionist who didn't know what to do with this imposing man in boots and a Stetson who had just dropped a pharmacy in her lap. "Richard," she said, saying his name exactly the way she had that night, like someone naming a thing they know, but are still trying to figure out the weight of. "Mary Ann," he replied. And then, without beating around the bush, having left his heavy armor back at the ranch, "My father asks about you every single week, but I didn't come here for him." She crossed her arms, not defensively, but with that posture she took when she was truly ready to listen. "I came because I finally learned the difference between taking care of property and taking care of people," he said, taking off his hat. "And I came to ask if you'd give me a chance to prove to you that I learned it." At that exact moment, in the tiny waiting room, there was a receptionist trying with Olympic-level effort to look busy with paperwork, and 2 patients who had completely given up, pretending they weren't eavesdropping on the best gossip of the year. Mary Ann noticed all of this out of the corner of her eye and felt a sudden urge to laugh. Not a mocking laugh, but the kind of laugh that bubbles up when life insists on being wilder than any plan you could ever make. "You were incredibly rude to me on my first day," she reminded him. "I was," he agreed without hesitation. "You laid down rules that only existed to remind me of my place." "I did. And you thought you could fix with money what you were too scared to fix with words. That's true, too." She stared at him for a long, quiet moment. Then she let her arms drop and said, "There's a diner on Main Street that bakes the best cherry pie in the county. My lunch break is at 12:15. And that was how, without marching bands, without grand public declarations, with no audience other than 2 sick patients and a nosy receptionist, Richard Sterling finally began to learn how to care for a human being. When word got out that Richard Sterling was driving out of his way religiously to visit the lower-class county nurse, Kerrville suffered a minor social earthquake. Eleanor Vance had to clutch her pearls and spent the entire week chewing on the absolute scandal of it all. Caroline mentioned at a society brunch that certain women know exactly how to play their cards when they get their foot in the door of a wealthy widower's house, a comment met with murmurs that reeked far more of jealousy than of moral outrage. Richard's older son called from Austin in a panic. "Dad, have you run a background check on this woman? Is she from a good family? What does she even have to her name?" Richard cut him off coldly. "She has character and decency. Last time I checked, those are the hardest things to find on the market today." And he hung up the phone. Mary Ann wasn't formally presented to high society overnight. Richard didn't throw a gala to validate her, and she never asked for one. Little by little, she simply became part of the landscape. She appeared on the courtyard bench next to Mr. Arthur on the weekends. She attended Sunday service without asking anyone's permission to sit in the good pews. And at the county fair, she line danced with old man Arthur, who had regained enough balance to hold his own on the floor, earning genuine applause from the crowd. She never tried to buy anyone's affection. She wasn't overly sweet. She didn't flatter the society ladies strategically, and she never tried to prove she was worthy. She was simply herself, direct, caring, unshakable. And there was something about that quiet authenticity that slowly disarmed people, even the most bitter ones. Martha, who never needed to be disarmed because she always had a heart of gold, started reserving the best chair by the kitchen window for Mary Ann whenever the younger woman walked in. It was a tiny gesture, the kind that speaks louder than a megaphone. In November of 1988, when the Texas Hill Country was turning crisp and cool, Richard Sterling and Mary Ann Hayes were married in a simple ceremony at a small church in Bandera. Not in the massive Kerrville sanctuary, because Mary Ann wanted to get married in her own turf, surrounded by the working-class people who had watched her grow up. It was a reception for 60 people, not 600. The bride wore a modest white dress, sewn by a local seamstress in 2 weeks. The groom wore a dark suit and left his Stetson at the door, because Mary Ann had once confessed she liked seeing his hair. Mr. Arthur sat in the front row, leaning on his walker, wearing his finest Western shirt and a bursting pride that his facial paralysis could no longer hide. Back in Kerrville, the gossip arrived before they even returned from their honeymoon. Eleanor Vance heard the news one afternoon and stayed quiet for the rest of the day, a heavy silence, the kind that carries regret but lacks the courage to say it out loud. Caroline made a venomous comment that this time nobody agreed with, because the wind had changed direction. The town had finally realized that the woman they had been tearing down was the exact same woman who had stayed awake saving old man Arthur's life at 3 in the morning, while they were all sleeping in silk sheets. Richard's youngest daughter, who lived in Austin and had the brains to keep her mouth shut until she met the woman, did attend the wedding. She went back to the city telling her friends that her new stepmother was the most grounded, real person she had met in her entire life. The older son didn't attend and took months to finally call. When he did, Richard answered, listened to his son's poorly constructed apologies and said, "When you're ready to meet the real her, the gates to the ranch are open." Arthur Sterling lived for 6 more years after the stroke, 6 years that shattered every optimistic medical prognosis. The old man attributed his long life without a shred of shame to the peach preserves Mary Ann brought him and the fact that she never let him give up. Mary Ann said it was just pure, unfiltered cowboy stubbornness. They were both right. Richard learned, stumbling and very slowly, that running a ranch is not the same as tending to a soul, that asserting authority is not the same as giving someone your presence. That silence can be the greatest comfort, when the person sitting next to you knows how to stay. Mary Ann didn't change the furniture in the manor, she didn't fire the ranch hands, and she certainly didn't mess with Martha's sacred kitchen hierarchy. But there was a different way of breathing in those hallways. The air was lighter, less heavy, and anyone who stepped foot on the Sterling Ridge Ranch for the first time felt that peace, even if they couldn't explain exactly where it came from. She kept working, not at the rural county clinic because the drive was too far, but at a private practice in Kerrville, where the head doctor hired her after a 5-minute interview. She never asked for permission to keep working when she got married. Richard never dared to ask her to quit. For both of them, it was something that wasn't even up for debate. One day, Eleanor Vance bumped into Mary Ann in the aisles of the local grocery store and said, with that forced cordiality of someone chewing on glass, "It is so wonderful to see you, Mary Ann. You look absolutely stunning." Mary Ann smiled genuinely, holding no grudges, and asked about Eleanor's daughter by name, with sincere interest. Eleanor walked away feeling incredibly small, not because Mary Ann had done anything to humiliate her, but because real, deeply rooted kindness will always strip fake politeness naked without ever having to raise its voice. This fictional story is about a man who had grown accustomed to confusing value with price, and about a woman who never made that mistake. It's about how true competence and talent don't ask for permission to be seen. They simply show up at 3 in the morning when everyone else has run away. It's about how pride protects you at the exact same time it poisons you, and how sometimes it takes someone with the guts to tell you the hard truth to finally move the boulder crushing your chest. But deep down, it's about something even simpler, the massive difference between the person who asks, "What does she have?" and the person who asks, "Who is she really?" Richard started out asking the first question, and the hard way, he learned to ask the second, and that is perhaps the most difficult growth a person can go through, not the kind that adds zeros to a bank account, not the kind that buys more acreage, but the kind that happens when someone finally decides to look a human being in the eye instead of looking at the price tag they're wearing. Have you ever judged someone based on their appearance, only to swallow your words when you realized how wrong you were? Or have you ever been judged by your clothes or your wallet before anyone bothered to find out who you are on the inside? Let me know down in the comments, because these fictional stories exist exactly to make us reflect on the real scripts we write every single day in our own lives. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear that character, and decency can't be bought with money. And subscribe to the channel, because every week there's a new story waiting for you. Stories about ordinary people making extraordinary choices, about love blooming in the driest dirt, and about the lessons life teaches us in the hardest, most beautiful ways possible. I'll see you in the next story. This is a fictional story created for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to actual persons or events is purely coincidental.